Chapter 9. Autosuggestion. The reader will now once more recall the fundamental psychological propositions upon which the science of mental medicine is based. They are: 1. That man is endowed with a dual mental organism, or mind, objective and subjective. 2. The subjective mind is constantly amenable to control by the power of suggestion. 3. The subjective mind controls the functions, sensations, and conditions of the body. At the risk of undue repetition, I again call attention to the obvious fact that if these propositions are true, man possesses within his own organism the means and the power to control disease, with or without aid from extraneous sources. I have now at some length discussed, seriatim, the above propositions with the object of impressing their exact truth upon the mind of the student, to the end that when he undertakes to apply them to practical uses he may know that he is wholly within the realm of scientific truth, and not groping in the darkness of medieval mysticism or savage superstition. In other words, I desire to inspire the mind of the student with that perfect faith which alone is born of a knowledge of scientific truth, as distinguished from the faith inspired by authority invested with mystery and occultism. Such was the faith of Jesus of Nazareth. He was endowed with a perfect knowledge of the laws of the human soul and of its power over the material universe, and he knew how to direct its energies in the healing of the diseases of the body. This was the secret of his transcendent power, of his never-failing success where the conditions could be commanded in the patient. He could not teach the science of mental therapeutics to his disciples, for they were mentally unprepared to receive or assimilate it. Their faith, therefore, was dependent alone upon the words and the example of the Master, and hence the frequent fluctuations of their power, even in his presence. It may be that science will never be able to impart a knowledge of the law of mental healing in such perfection as Jesus possessed it, but in view of his promises, may we not reasonably hope to attain a knowledge sufficient for the practical purposes of life? It is in this hope that I have endeavored to point out what I conceive to be at least a valid working hypothesis for mental medicine. To that end, I have discussed inductively the three fundamental propositions, with what success the reader must judge. I have also pointed out some of the sources of danger arising from popular ignorance of the law of suggestion. I have dwelt upon the innumerable suggestions adverse to health which constantly beset the people of civilized countries, and pointed out some of their sources. I have laid particular stress upon those suggestions which attack the digestive organs, because they are the most common and easily recognized, and, on the whole, the most important. Obviously, whatever impairs our powers of digestion and assimilation saps the citadel of our material power. But in dwelling upon that particular source of popular danger from suggestion, it must not be inferred that other diseases are excluded. On the contrary, it is well known that there is no disease of the human body that may not be created, or simulated, by the power of mind when stimulated by suggestion. It is asserted by physicians of experience that in cholera epidemics a large proportion, more than half, of the cases are the result of fear, otherwise suggestion. There is nothing to distinguish such cases from those of true Asiatic cholera, except, perhaps, the absence of the true cholera germ, or bacillus, in the suggestive cases. It is certain that all the salient symptoms of true cholera are present in that which is induced by suggestion, and that the percentage of fatal cases is greater in the latter class of cases. Again, it is well known that almost anyone can cause an increased flow of blood to any part or organ of the body by merely concentrating his attention upon the part. If this can be done experimentally, it follows that persistence in such concentration will eventually induce congestion, especially if the concentration is prompted by fear of disease of the organ. It follows that no organ of the human body is immune from that prolific cause of disease. I know that I shall be trespassing upon the domain of a popular surgical fad when I venture to instance appendicitis as a possible example of a disease caused by expectant attention or suggestion. Certain it is that in the good old days, before it was generally known that man had such a thing as a vermiform appendix concealed about his person, cases of appendicitis were very rare. And when one did come to light, it was invariably said to be due to the presence of some foreign substance, generally a seed of some fruit that the patient had eaten. But since it was discovered that the vermiform appendix can be removed for a few $100s without necessarily killing the patient out of hand, the people have been educated in respect to that mysterious portion of their anatomy. And cases of appendicitis have multiplied proportionately, so that now it must be a very ignorant man, or a very poor one, who cannot manage to have at least one case of appendicitis. And no surgeon can properly be considered up to date who has been unable to capture at least half a dozen vermiform appendices. I am not unmindful that surgeons are provided with a very plausible explanation of this phenomenal increase of cases of appendicitis within the last quarter of a century. They explain it on the ground that there are really no more cases of appendicitis now than formerly, in proportion to the population, but that, owing to ignorance, the doctors formerly attributed such cases to other causes, such as peritonitis, and thus sacrificed many lives that might have been saved by an operation had the seed of the disease been recognized. Candor compels the admission that there may be much truth in the explanation, but it certainly does not account for all the increase, nor does it explain certain salient peculiarities of modern appendicitis. For instance, formerly that disease was always attributed to the presence of some irritant foreign substance in the mouth of the appendix. Now, in more than half of the cases, no foreign substance is found. But, in all reported cases, serious inflammation was found to exist, enough, at least, to confirm the doctor's diagnosis and justify the operation. What the unreported cases reveal there is no means of knowing. One of the salient peculiarities of the modern variety of appendicitis is that it prevails most among the educated, refined, and well-to-do. It seems to avoid carefully the homes of poverty and ignorance. I have no statistics to verify this statement, and it may be all wrong, but it is popularly believed to be true that appendicitis is the rich man's disease. I certainly have never known of a case that contradicts that belief, but it would be grossly unjust to the medical profession to accept the popular explanation of the fact, which is, of course, that the doctor's diagnosis is governed by the ability of the patient to pay for an operation. This is not only palpably unjust, but it is unnecessary. In fact, if there was no other explanation, I should doubt the fact, for they are all honorable men. To those who have followed what has been said in regard to the potency of suggestion, it will be apparent that the prevalence of the disease among the educated classes is just what one might expect, for the following reasons. In the first place, it is only the educated classes who know much about the disease, and it requires some knowledge of anatomy to locate definitely the vermiform appendix. The essential conditions necessary to enable one to concentrate his mind upon that appendage are, therefore, present with the well-informed and entirely absent in the minds of the ignorant. That is to say, one must know where to expect pain before he can induce it by expectant attention. The ignorant, however, are not always immune, provided they think they know where to look for untoward symptoms, and are cursed with a morbid suggestibility. For instance, I knew one of that class who once became excited on the subject of appendicitis and proceeded to inquire of a friend just where the vermiform appendix might be found. His friend, knowing his proneness to experience the symptoms of every disease he happened to read about, purposely misinformed him by giving him to understand that it was located on the left side of the lower abdomen. As usual, he began to watch for symptoms, and, as usual, he was soon rewarded by feeling a decided uneasiness in the locality named. In less than a week, he felt compelled to appeal to a specialist for relief, which was instantly afforded, both as to his mind and his body, by being informed that he had selected the wrong locality for a good case of appendicitis. Nevertheless, it required the application of hot fomentations to relieve the inflammation that had actually been induced in the suggested location. It is needless to say that if he had been correctly informed by his friend, the surgeon would not have been defrauded of a genuine case. Again, appendicitis is such a formidable proposition, so distressing while it lasts, and its cure fraught with such danger to life, that it naturally excites the utmost dread in the minds of those who are familiar with the current literature on the subject. It would, therefore, constitute an exception to all known diseases if it failed to be attended with the usual results due to morbid suggestibility. The class thus afflicted, after reading up on the subject, begin by being very careful not to swallow any more fruit seeds, and if one accidentally slips down, they immediately begin to concentrate their minds upon their insides. The slightest symptom of uneasiness in the proper locality is magnified 1,000-fold, vigilance is redoubled and intensified, and the consequent pain and inflammation is induced. The result is an operation, revealing a case of appendicitis minus the tangible cause. The expected seed, or other irritant, is not in evidence. Another exciting cause of morbid suggestibility on this subject is the mystery with which science, or the want of it, has invested the vermiform appendix. Scientists tell us that it is the vestigial remains of some organ that is no longer useful, whatever it may have been to our remote ancestors. This may be true, but the idea seems analogous to other assertions of science which are obviously made to conceal ignorance. Thus, scientists are prone to deny the existence of all occult things that they cannot explain, as in psychic phenomena. But the vermiform appendix is a tangible reality the existence of which cannot be denied, and inasmuch as they are ignorant of its uses, they declare it to be useless. In other words, according to the theory of science, nature made a mistake in creating it, a mistake all the more flagrant and inexcusable in that this functionless organ gray was placed not where it would do the most good, but where it is a constant menace to life. If nature were in the habit of making mechanical mistakes in the construction of vital organs, the appendix vermiformis might be charged up to that source. But, as no other organ has been found to be functionless, it must be presumed that God is wiser than man, wiser, if possible, than the scientists who can find no other than professional uses for the vermiform appendix, and that in the fullness of time that organ will be able to find a valid excuse for existing. In the meantime, it will continue to be constantly enhancing in value as a source of revenue for surgeons, so long, at least, as the public remains in ignorance of the potency of suggestions adverse to health. It is obvious that the remarks made in regard to cholera and appendicitis apply with equal force and pertinency to hundreds of other prevailing diseases, as well as to those diseases of the digestive organs mentioned in preceding chapters. The lesson is obvious, and it applies to all alike. It is that any disease that can be induced by suggestion can be avoided either by a counter-suggestion or by ignoring the adverse suggestion. This is the most important lesson that any school of mental medicine has to teach, and it is but a practical expression of the old aphorism that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Moreover, it is a lesson that anyone can put into instant practice and reap an immediate reward. The science of mental healing is, indeed, important, but it requires more or less training and experience, whereas the ability to avoid disease by mental processes is within easy reach of all sane persons who understand the fundamental principles, or the salient facts, of the law of suggestion. The following self-evident propositions will make my meaning clear. 1. The efficacy of mental medicine is dependent upon mental conditions. 2. Mental healing is accomplished by the induction of favoring mental conditions in the patient. 3. The one prepotent means of inducing that mental condition is suggestion. 4. The power or energy that is capable of inducing a mental condition favorable to healing disease is capable of preventing disease by the same process. 5. The power that is equal to the task of either preventing or healing disease by mental processes is necessarily equal to the production of disease, conditions being reversed. 6. Suggestion, therefore, is the one prepotent mental energy which is capable of inducing, preventing, or healing disease. It follows that suggestion is of practical value to man in exact proportion to the uses which he makes of it. That is to say, he may make it a blessing or a curse according to the uses for which it is employed. But use it he must, for it pervades the mental atmosphere as the sunlight of heaven pervades the solar system. He cannot escape it, for it is one of nature's all-pervasive forces and knows no variableness nor shadow of turning. Like every other law of nature, it is primarily for the highest benefit of mankind. But, like every other beneficent energy, it may destroy him if, either through ignorance or perversity, he fails to place himself in harmony with it. It is a maxim of criminal jurisprudence that ignorance of the law excuseth no man, yet courts and juries sometimes exercise a discretionary clemency in cases where it is clear that no wrong was intended. But nature is inexorable in the exaction of the fullest penalties for the violation of her laws, whether through perversity or ignorance, and as I have before remarked, the more beneficent the law, the more severe are the penalties for its violation. I have pointed out the fact that in this country popular ignorance of the law of suggestion has made us a nation of dyspeptics, multiplied the rate of mortality and epidemic diseases, and virtually created a new surgical disease, painful to the last degree, fatal if not cured, and dangerous in the extreme in the process of cure, and yet I have covered only a small part of the field where ignorance of the law and false suggestions are doing their fatal work. I have done this, not as an alarmist, not for the purpose of advertising and promoting the sale of a newfangled patent nostrum, not even for the purpose of advocating a new system of healing disease. In Part 2 of this book, I shall point out what I conceive to be the most rational method of practicing the art of mental healing. But thus far I have devoted my energies to the task of familiarizing the public mind with the fundamental law, the violation of which entails disease everywhere, to the end that I might point out a remedy, without money and without price, and within the reach of all, whereby the great bulk of current diseases may be avoided, and doctors and their medicines relegated to a state of innocuous desuetude. Those who have followed my remarks thus far have already anticipated the substance of the few words of advice with which I propose to close this part of my work. There are two ways of avoiding the effects of current suggestions adverse to health. The first is by avoiding the suggestions themselves, and the second is by opposing a counter self-suggestion. The first is the easier and more effective, but it applies principally to those whose health is not already impaired by adverse suggestions or other influences. What is here meant by avoiding adverse suggestions is that one should avoid reading, talking, or thinking about pathological conditions of the human body. This may seem like an advocacy of popular ignorance of those subjects, and in a sense it is such, but it is justified on the ground that the health of the masses is of greater importance than popular education and pathology besides. The inhibition does not exclude a proper amount of popular education in anatomy and physiology, but the study of disease should be restricted to those who expect to engage in the practice of the art of healing the sick. In this connection, the reader will not forget what has been said of the proneness of medical students, and even of some doctors, to evoke in themselves, by unconscious autosuggestion, the symptoms of every disease they are called upon to study. My remarks, however, are not intended to apply to the acquisition of a truly scientific knowledge of pathology, whatever the object may be, but it is hoped that they may serve as a warning, even to medical students, against the practice of introspection with the view of finding symptoms corresponding with those they are studying. What I do strongly advise against is the common practice of reading, studying, and inwardly digesting the popular literature on the subjects of disease, and especially of diet. I have already stated my reasons at some length, and it is unnecessary to repeat beyond reminding the reader that the current stuff on those subjects is generally written by those who know least about them, often by cranks who are themselves the victims of false suggestions by other cranks, and they of others, and so on ad infinitum. We have already seen how a false suggestion, based upon a false premise, perpetuates itself from generation to generation and spreads itself over new domains which are entirely foreign to the original, as from religion to diet and from diet to medicine, etc. Horace Greeley once remarked that the way to resume specie payments is to resume. In like manner, the lesson we are seeking to enforce may be summarized. The way to avoid suggestions adverse to health is to avoid them. That is to say, never allow them to enter your mind from any avoidable source, and if they have been thrust upon you by others, avoid dwelling upon them in your meditations. Above all, do not make a personal application to yourself of everything you chance to hear about the food that others have found by personal experience to be hurtful, for the chances are 1,000 to 1 that they are themselves simply the victims of false suggestions. In other words, avoid introspection while eating and during the process of digestion, for you will surely find what you are looking for, especially if you are expecting symptoms of indigestion. Again, as you value the well-being of your family and friends, do not obtrude your own ideas, if you have any, about the unwholesomeness of particular dishes on the bill of fare before you. Remember that others have rights which ought to be indefeasible, among which is the right to the undisturbed enjoyment of the pleasures of the table and the consequent good digestion. But if you are an average dietetic crank, this advice will go unheeded. For that ubiquitous personality enjoys nothing at the table except making his own infirmities conspicuous and warning others of the wrath to come if they indulge in anything fit to eat. It is a fact, confirmed by extensive observation, that one such crank, turned loose upon a perfectly healthy family, with digestive organs previously unimpaired, will gradually inoculate the whole family with his mental virus, and cause the most healthful articles of food, one by one, to be banished from the table as indigestible. The exercise of just a little common sense will enable you to avert the consequences of such suggestions when they are thrust upon you at the table by some crank whose flow of eloquence you do not feel at liberty to restrain. All one needs to do, in most cases, is to ask oneself what reason is found in common experience, or in the inherent character of the food itself, for pronouncing it indigestible or otherwise hurtful. If none is found, he is provided with a counter-suggestion based upon reason and experience, and it is his own fault if he allows the false suggestion, which contravenes reason and experience, to obtain the mastery. But if, on the other hand, he is not endowed with common sense, or, in other words, if he belongs to the class of chronic reformers, he will be apt to accept the false suggestion for the very reason that it condemns the habits and contravenes the experience of mankind. Whatever is wrong being their shibboleth, they condemn every existing institution, custom, or habit found in civilization. And hence they inveigh against the common diet of civilized mankind with the same emotional enthusiasm that they would manifest in a crusade against the institution of human slavery. In point of fact, the chronic reformer is a factor that must be reckoned with, in more ways than one, when dealing with suggestions adverse to health and the good order of society, for he is as apt to attack the practice of monogamy as of polygamy. And even when he institutes a crusade against the recognized evils of society, he frequently does more harm than good. He not only brings his cause into disrepute by intemperate zeal and idiotic methods, as in the hatchet crusade for the reformation of drunkards, but the average temperance fanatic is full of suggestions that have a direct tendency to encourage drunkenness. Thus, the drunkard is constantly told that he is such because it is impossible for him to resist the temptation to drink when he feels like it, that it is impossible for him to reform so long as liquor is for sale, and that it is impossible for him to resist the temptation to abuse his family when he is drunk. These suggestions are so persistently iterated and reiterated and drummed into the ears of the poor drunkards that 9/10 of them actually believe them, and hence regard themselves as helpless victims to be pitied and coddled, rather than as criminals deserving the lash. The result is that they do not try to resist, because the suggestion is with them that it is impossible. The most potent suggestion, however, that the drunkard is beset withal, is the one that tells him that when he has taken one drink it is impossible for him to refrain from taking a second, and a third, and so on, until he is in a condition that renders it necessary for him to go home and pound his wife. The reason is not far to seek. It is well known to psychologists that drunkards, especially of the class now referred to, are thrown into the subjective condition by drinking anything intoxicating. This is true of most people, but it is especially true of those who are in the habit of drinking to excess, and in many cases one glass is sufficient to induce the subjective condition to such an extent as to render them extremely amenable to suggestion. It follows that when one of that class has taken one drink, the ever-present suggestion that he cannot refrain from taking another exerts its full influence upon him. And the result is that he does not try to resist the temptation to plunge into a prolonged debauch. When remonstrated with after the debauch is ended, he invariably says that after taking the first drink he is moved by an uncontrollable impulse to take another, after which he loses all desire to restrain himself. This indicates the purely subjective origin of the impulse, and distinguishes it from the ordinary desire for stimulants arising from nervous or mental depression. Its subjective origin is further indicated by the fact that the impulse amounts to a positive mania, and hence it is designated as dipsomania, to distinguish it from ordinary habitual drunkenness. Like other manias, it is a mental disease arising from some form of suggestion, and the only obvious form of suggestion that could produce the result would be such as I have indicated. It is true that it may be partly traditional, but at any rate it is kept alive and potent by the constantly reiterated declaration by temperance extremists that the poor drunkard, having once tasted liquor, is powerless to restrain himself from continuing the debauch. It not only confirms the dipsomaniac in his infirmity, but it has a constant tendency to convert the ordinary habitual drunkard into a victim of that most appalling and dangerous of all forms of inebriety. This may seem like a digression, but it is justified by its importance, as showing that a prolific source of suggestions adverse to health, as well as to the good order of society, is found in the fanatics and degenerates who infest every civilized community. Nothing is too sacred to be meddled with by the hysterical imbecile who holds that whatever is wrong. The distinguishing characteristic of a normal manhood is the ability to adapt oneself to his environment. Individually, the crank is known by his inability to live in harmony with any of his environmental conditions, religious, political, or sociological. Collectively, they are recognized by their propensity to organize themselves into societies for the promulgation of new ideas, especially such as are either incapable of verification or are palpably out of harmony with established truth. As one values a healthful mental environment, he should avoid them as he would a pestilence. Truth perpetuates itself by virtue of its own inherent vitality, and it organizes its own following from among those who recognize it by its harmony with all other truth. It needs no human organization to promulgate it, for it is self-generating, nor to perpetuate it, for it is eternal. Every truth is itself a part of an organized system, which is coextensive with the universe of God. Hence no truth is unimportant or insignificant, for the grand system would be incomplete without it. Suspend one law of physical nature but for one moment, and the physical universe would disintegrate. Suspend one law of mind and soul, and mental chaos would supervene. And as all the laws of nature are interrelated and constitute one stupendous unitary system, it follows that a suspension of one law, physical or mental, would result in universal chaos. Analogous to the suspension of a natural law is its violation, for in either case the harmony of the universe is disturbed. The results differ only in that, in the case of the violation of law, the inharmony affects only the guilty party and his dependents. But as to them, the appropriate penalties are inflicted with inexorable exactitude in proportion to the extent to which the law is violated. Evil, therefore, is but another name for inharmony, and its origin is found in the violation of the laws of God, physical, mental, or moral. The laws themselves are not evil, nor are they productive of evil. From the greatest to the least, they are designed for the ultimate good of man, provided only that he places himself in harmony with them. They are the embodiment of eternal truth, and no false conclusion or suggestion can be derived from a knowledge of their provisions. On the other hand, every falsehood, every error, every wrong idea is a prolific source of possible evil, for no correct conclusion can be drawn from a false premise. Hence the suggestions arising from error and falsehood are necessarily wrong, misleading, and productive of untold evil consequences, and hence the necessity for constantly guarding the portals of the subjective mind against them. The safest sentinel to put on guard for that purpose is reason, and the price of safety is eternal vigilance. This brings us to a consideration of the second method of averting the consequences of the current suggestions adverse to health. This method, as before stated, consists in the interposition of a countervailing suggestion whenever an adverse suggestion is thrust upon you. The method is simple to the last degree, and it is as effective as it is easy of application. It consists in denying the truth of the adverse suggestion. By this I do not mean that an open controversy should be indulged in. On the contrary, that should be avoided, for it would merely cause a reiteration of the suggestion with increased emphasis and a fresh eruption of persuasive eloquence. The denial should be made mentally, and it should be persisted in as long as the suggestion continues to be inflicted. After that, the subject should be ignored, banished from the mind. A good way to silence a chronic dyspeptic is to boast of your own good digestive powers. It may be impolite, and certainly nothing so deeply offends a chronic dyspeptic as to be told that somebody else is immune from that malady. But self-preservation is the first law of nature. You owe it to yourself to shield your own mental and physical organism from the virus that is poisoning his, and the assertion that your digestive powers are perfect is the surest way to make them perfect, or to keep them so. It is a countervailing autosuggestion which you owe to yourself, even at the risk of enraging your friend, the chronic dyspeptic. Chronic invalids of all kinds are prone to discourse exhaustively on the subject of their miseries whenever they can victimize a sympathetic listener. Their egotism is unbounded, and it never occurs to them that the full history of their aches, their pains, their symptoms, and their movements may not possess the same absorbing interest to others that it does to themselves. Nor does it occur to them that they are inflicting a positive wrong upon their listeners by filling their minds with suggestions adverse to their own health. Sympathy is the boon they crave, and it is all too often injudiciously extended to them, for the sympathetic remarks of friends often amount to suggestions that confirm and increase the morbid mental condition of the sufferer. For instance, the most dangerous blessing that a chronic dyspeptic can have about him is a sympathetic wife who is ignorant of the law of suggestion. Her constant watchfulness over his diet is something appalling. Knowing his infirmity and dreading his erratic temper when he is stricken with a fit of indigestion, she conscientiously arms herself with all the current misinformation on the subject of dietetics, and proceeds to make his life miserable at mealtimes by doling it out as occasion seems to require. With true wifely devotion she watches every mouthful that he attempts to regale himself withal, and pounces upon him at intervals with, "Henry, you must not eat this, or that, or the other. It will surely make you sick." And if Henry heeds her admonitions, he makes his meal of bran bread, or, perhaps, of some other equally innutritious mush that is advertised in the newspapers as being predigested. The result is that he rises from the table with his digestive apparatus still further weakened by disuse, atrophied for the want of exercise, confirmed in its vicious habits by a fresh installment of pernicious suggestions. Suggestions made by the best of wives with the best intentions. His whole body becomes weakened for the lack of proper nutriment, and he becomes an easy prey to every disease that prevails in his vicinage. He becomes morbid in mind as well as in body. He dwells upon his infirmities in his meditations, and, in pursuit of sympathy, thrusts them upon the attention of all with whom he comes in contact. If he gets the coveted sympathy, he is confirmed in his morbidity. If not, he gets mad, and complains that the whole world is in league against him, and if anyone, in self-defense, presumes to mention his own good health, he is immediately catalogued as an enemy who is seeking to destroy the only comfort and consolation derivable from dyspepsia. On the other hand, the hypothetical Henry sometimes rebels against his wife's sympathetic espionage. Weak for the lack of nourishment, he comes to the table with an enormous appetite and proceeds to eat what he likes best, regardless of the apprehensions of his faithful wife and monitor. But he does not escape her admonitions, for she is sure to remind him that his stomach is diseased and his appetite morbid, craving only that which is indigestible, and so on to the end of the dismal chapter. But Henry is defiant, and, prompted by both appetite and perversity, overloads his stomach. Then follows a season of reflection upon the suggestions that have been made, self-condemnation for having eaten anything at all, and the usual introspection, watching for untoward symptoms, which he is sure to experience. If he is in business, he goes in search of his employees, and discharges the best of them, swears at the rest of them, kicks the office cat, jumps upon his hat, and otherwise disports himself with an eye single to conquering comfort and consolation by making everybody else as miserable as he is himself. All of this might have been averted by a little judicious withholding of wifely sympathy, especially at mealtimes. The only safe rule, either for dyspeptics or well persons, is to taboo rigidly the subject of dietetics as a topic of conversation at mealtimes. Incalculable injury is often inflicted upon the children of healthy households by the incessant watchfulness of parents over their diet, especially in regard to desserts or other luxuries of which they are particularly fond. A due amount of caution is, of course, necessary, but it should be exercised when ordering the bill of fare, and it generally is. No sane person puts a dish before his children that is hurtful. But to hear the average parent discourse to his children upon the hurtfulness of the food set before them, one would think that the cook was suspected of having resolved to poison the whole family. The truth is that 9/10 of the talk to children about the hurtfulness of food is prompted by motives of economy. It is a constipation of the pocketbook, rather than the hurtfulness of food, that causes many a child to be tortured by the presence of luxuries that he is not permitted to enjoy in common with the older members of the family. But whatever the motive may be, the point is that the luxuries of the table should never be denied to children on the ground that they are hurtful. In the first place, if they are actually hurtful, they should not be on the table. If not, a double wrong is perpetrated against the child. To say nothing of the heartless selfishness involved in depriving a child, from motives of sordid stinginess, of his share of the good things on the table. The example set before him of falsehood and deceit on the part of the parents is a moral wrong that may affect the child's whole future. If he does not follow their example, he will at least despise his parents for setting it. Be that as it may, the outrage upon his physical organism is sure to be followed by its legitimate consequences, namely, a disordered stomach and weakened powers of digestion. The seeds of the disease which has distinguished us as a nation of dyspeptics are sown in the minds of our children at the table by the incessant nagging of ignorant or sordid parents. Nor is the wrong thus inflicted upon the little ones measured alone by the false suggestions and their inevitable consequences. The appetite of the average child is not only a good measure of its digestive powers, but its longings are the best evidences of what it needs. For instance, many children are possessed of what the average mother regards as a morbid appetite for sweets, and sweets are, consequently, inhibited. With the inevitable suggestions regarding the hurtfulness of good things in general and sweet things in particular. Of course, the more strictly sweets are inhibited, the more intense are the child's longings for them. This the mother usually regards as natural perversity, inherited from our grandmother Eve, and she redoubles her vigilance accordingly. Now, the truth is that children have an appetite for sugar because they need sugar, because of a deficiency in the physical organism of the element which saccharin, matter in some form alone supplies. Nature cries out for it with an insistence proportioned to its necessities, just as it cries out for water when the supply of that element is deficient. The obvious lesson is that when a child develops a strong appetite for sweets, instead of filling its mind with false suggestions as to the hurtfulness of what it craves, it should be given free and unlimited access to the sugar bowl. Nothing is more nutritious than sugar, and few things are more easily digested and assimilated. As in case of all other nutritious foods, a strong appetite for it is good evidence, not only that the system needs it, but that the stomach can digest it, provided always that the functions of that organ are not interfered with by adverse suggestions. Suggestions apart, few children who have a strong appetite for sugar have ever been injured by giving it to them in practically unlimited quantities. On the other hand, many such have been grievously injured by being deprived of it, and I have known weakly, puny children to be rendered strong and robust by satisfying what appeared to the mother to be a morbid craving for sugar. The remarks made about sugar apply with somewhat diminishing force, perhaps, to foods of which sugar is a prominent ingredient. For example, the ordinary sweet cakes and other desserts in common use on American tables. Few, if any, are so compounded as to justify withholding them from children who are fond of them. It is not my province, however, in a work like this, to lay down any hard and fast rules of diet. This is not a cookbook, nor is it a treatise on dietetics. My duty will have been performed to the best of my ability when I point out the salient features of typical cases where false and pernicious suggestions do their deadly work. In other words, I can only point out general principles and invite attention to a few illustrative examples. In carrying the principles into practice, everything must necessarily be left to private judgment, and I can only enjoin upon my readers the necessity of exercising just a little common sense, remembering that there are but a few simple rules to observe in the employment of suggestion as a prophylactic or preventive of disease. The most important are the following. 1. Avoid all suggestions from extraneous sources which are adverse to health. 2. If such suggestions are forced upon you, meet them by counter-suggestions affirmative of your own immunity from the suggested diseases. 3. Inhibit all conversation at the table adverse to the quality of the food set before you, especially as to its supposed indigestibility. 4. Never refuse to give a child the food it desires on the ground of its hurtfulness. If you are too stingy to give him what he wants, say so. But, as you value the health of your child, never suggest that the food he eats is able to make him sick. First, because you know you are lying, and, secondly, because he will find it out someday and despise you for it. 5. Talk hopefully to the chronic invalid, for his sake, and for your own sake. When you leave him, thank God that you are immune from his diseases. 6. Think health and talk health on all suitable occasions, remembering that under the law of suggestion health may be made contagious as well as disease. 7. Finally, meet the first symptom of disease with a vigorous and persistent autosuggestion of your immunity from disease or of your ability to throw it off. When you go to bed at night, direct your subjective mind to employ itself during your sleep in restoring normal conditions, strongly affirming its ability to do so, and when you rise in the morning, assume the attitude, in mind and body, of restored health and vigor. Should these prophylactic efforts fail to produce the desired effect, and should disease come upon you in spite of them, it is not the fault of the system. It is because you are not well grounded in the conditions precedent to success. Mental remedies are dependent for success upon mental conditions, just as physical remedies are dependent for their efficacy upon physical conditions. Obviously, the necessary mental conditions cannot always be commanded in the adult who has been reared in an atmosphere of doubt and incredulity regarding the efficacy of other than material remedies. Faith in the latter has been crystallized into a race prejudice which has been enhanced by the gross superstitions and obvious charlatanry of many who practice mental therapeutics. It will take years, perhaps centuries, to overcome the evil thus wrought. Again, there are many who fail through persistent perversity, or, to put the most charitable construction upon their conduct, through sheer weakness of intellect. Inability to comprehend the simplest proposition relating to the conditions of success in suggestive therapeutics. Nothing can induce them to assume a hopeful or even a passive attitude of mind. They take special delight in being able to say that they have not been benefited in the least by the treatment, even when it is a palpable falsehood. In a word, no argument can induce them to refrain from continually making autosuggestions adverse not only to their own health, but to the possibility of its restoration by other than material remedies. Obviously, suggestive treatment, in the ordinary sense of the word, is not adapted to such cases. It must be a marvated suggestion pitzer, if any, that can overcome either the perversity or the imbecility thus manifested. To such, and to all who from any cause fail to experience the benefits of suggestive treatment, my advice is to go at once to the physician in whom they have the most confidence, without reference to the school to which he belongs. It is far more important that you should have confidence in your physician than it is that he should know anything about your case, for in the latter event he will doubtless give you a placebo, which is always safe, and usually efficacious when administered with its due proportion of suggestion. This is what Dr. Pitzer designates as a larvated suggestion. It is in common use among the medical profession, and its value as a therapeutic agent cannot be overestimated.